Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more Massacre El Mozote. It's been a while. Of course, we just got through with Spooktober, so yeah, this is kind of coming back. But yeah. Anyway, let's go ahead and just hop right into this. Um, From the beginning, the Salvadoran Civil War had been a personal affair. El Salvador is small. Salvadoran families are large, and especially in the countryside, it was not uncommon for a single family to include soldiers and guerrillas. Cousins, sometimes brothers, faced one another across the battlefield. It seemed almost destined. Then the duel between the most brilliant officer in the army and the guerrillas' reputed military genius would become a deeply personal matter. Villalobos and Monterrosa were obsessed with each other's psychology. Annunziata said, for Monterrosa, it was like looking in a mirror. He had this obsession with the guerrillas, with knowing them, understanding them. He had studied all the different groups and claimed he could always tell which one had staged an operation. He felt he was the alter ego of the guerrillas. Every night out in the field, he would listen to the radio, first the BBC and then the radio Venceramos, listening to what they said he'd done that day. Every night you could hear coming from his hammock the Internacional playing over Radio Venceramos. As it happened, Monterrosa's fascination with Radio Venceramos, his capture of the transmitter after all, had been the high point of Operation Rescue, had not escaped the notice of his alter ego. A basic principle of warfare is to study the psychology of the enemy commanders, Villalobos told me. Monterrosa was obsessed with war trophies. He got personally involved in combat situations when his men captured something to such an extent that at times he lost the ability to coordinate troop movements. Once he arrived personally to take charge of video records that they had captured from us. Another time it was a scale model that we had used to plan an attack. Each time he came himself, and he was desperate to stop Radio Venceramos. I mean, any cassette or tape recorder he found was turned into a great victory. Increasingly, in late 1983 and into 1984, Monterrosa had victories to celebrate. His Beans and Bullets campaign was making progress in Morazan. The area under FMLN control was gradually shrinking, and so, even more critically, was the guerrillas' manpower base. By the summer of 1984, reports had begun circulating that the guerrillas were reduced to conscripting civilians into their ranks. Very good news indeed for the Army. Around this time, General Blandon, the Army Chief of Staff, flew to Parkin to see Monterrosa. I offered him command of the army, Blandon told me. But he said he wouldn't agree, or he wouldn't accept it. If that was to happen, he said, it should happen in the normal course of events. You see, he was not driven by any personal ambition to be the defense minister, but rather by the need to finish the job at hand. That September, the Americans gave the Army 10 new Huey helicopters. When I saw the news about the helicopters, I told a friend, "Monterrosa will be coming after us," Villalobos said. "He will use those helicopters to attack the command post." The delivery of the helicopters, not coincidentally, came at the time of a major diplomatic initiative by the Salvadoran government. On October the 15th, President José Napoleón Duarte, he had won the election earlier that year and replaced Magana, joined Minister of Defense Carlos Eugenio Vides Casanova and other government representatives in a meeting with guerrilla leaders. Among them Guillermo Ungo, who had been Duarte's vice presidential running mate in the stolen elections of 1972 in La Palma, about 80 miles west of Morazan. 3 days after the meeting, Monterrosa launched a major offensive in Morazan, a 6,000-man sweep called Torola 4. The war goes on, he told James Lemoyne of the New York Times as they stood at the base in Osicala, watching the men of the Atlacatl board the new Huey helicopters and lift off into the northern sky. There are times when you have to make war to gain peace. Villalobos would be coordinating the response to Torola 4, a campaign that, in its broad outline, appeared much like Operation Rescue 3 years before. Soldiers from regular army units were storming north across the Torola, and the helicopter-borne men of the Atlacatl were moving down from Perquin and other mountain towns. This time, however, the guerrillas' response would be somewhat different. Villalobos and his staff were hard at work preparing an ambush for the town of Jalteca, a few miles east of El Mozote. It was a well-planned ambush. They had devoted many hours to its preparation, but an unusual one. The guerrillas were planning to have the army ambush them and thus capture a prize that they very much wanted Monterrosa to claim. On October the 22nd, Monterrosa helicoptered into Jalteca. With him was, among others, John Lee Anderson of Time. "It was real air mobile ops," Anderson told me in an interview. "Flying around from one place to another, inserting troops, choppering around, moving several times a day. In Jalteca," he said, "an advanced platoon had flushed out the guerrillas the day before. Now the people were gathered there, waiting for Monterrosa. It was a turfy plaza in this ramshackle old hamlet. You know, cobblestones, shaded front porches, and he gathered the townspeople around and gave them this hearts and minds sort of speech. He was sitting on a table with a microphone in his hand, and he had a woman social worker and a civilian psychologist there beside him." Anderson quotes Monterrosa as telling the peasants, "We are your true brothers. We're not the caretakers of the rich. Do you see any rich among us? We give our blood to the soil, but it's up to you to make it fertile." Around that time, not far from the plaza where Monterrosa was speaking, his men had pounced on a group of hapless guerrillas. We sent a column of our fighters to fall into an ambush, Villalobos said, and then they were supposed to leave the transmitter as if, they'd had to abandon it, as they had to do 3 years before. But it didn't work out that way. We weren't able to get the transmitter up to where the combat took place. We were upset. We thought we had blown the operation. They should have been suspicious. The rebels had left the transmitter near a graveyard on the outskirts of Jalteca. Not far away, Villalobos and his men were waiting tensely, listening intently on their radios. Suddenly, they heard soldiers begin to talk excitedly to one another. As soon as they found the transmitter, there was a big celebration. Villalobos said, "We could hear them talking about the prizes they would get and so on." The soldiers began to congratulate one another, speculating on how happy the colonel would be when his men brought him this priceless treasure. There was not a hint of suspicion. Just as vanity blinded Monterrosa, it blinded his soldiers as well, Villalobos said. We just had to wait for his personal psychology to play himself out. Late in the afternoon, John Lee Anderson sat down to interview the colonel. He disappeared for a while and he came back very excited, Anderson said. He sat down next to me on the stoop of this old peasant house and he confided to me that he had found the transmitter. It was in the graveyard in a cemetery at the edge of the little hamlet. This was somewhat far from where things were happening, it's true, but the town had definitely been theirs. There was graffiti everywhere. Anderson seized that moment as darkness fell over Jalteca to ask Monterrosa about the rumors that still clung to him about what had happened at El Mozote. It was late, and we were sitting there, just the two of us, and I said, "Colonel, ¿qué pasó en El Mozote?" And there was this long pause. And he looked away, and finally he said, "No es como dicen. It's not like they say." Monterrosa would say no more, but Anderson took his answer as a tacit confirmation that something had happened there, that Monterrosa had been involved in the massacre. Shortly before, James Lemoyne had asked Monterrosa the same question, and according to Lemoyne, the colonel, in the aftermath of a long and exhausting day of combat, had answered more bluntly. He shrugged and said, "Yeah, we did it. We carried out a limpieza there. We killed everyone." Lemoyne told me, he said, "In those days, I thought that was what we had to do to win the war, and I was wrong." Late that evening, Anderson and the photographer left somewhat regretfully for the capital. They needed to file their stories, but they intended to rejoin Monterrosa in his chopper the following day. The next day, 3 senior officers and a 3-man army television crew arrived in Jalteca along with the local priest and sacristan. They planned to accompany the victorious colonel as he carried his prize back to the capital. It was to be a triumphal entrance. The capture of the transmitter was an enormous propaganda victory, and Monterrosa wanted to film it, record it, publicize it, to milk it for all it was worth. The men climbed aboard the helicopter and took their seats, and as the rotors roared overhead, soldiers began loading the equipment aboard. Sitting in the place of honor beside Monterrosa, as it happened, was Todd Greentree of the United States Embassy. "We were sitting together," Greentree said. "He was buckling in and the people were stowing aboard all these duffel bags that belonged to different soldiers, you know. Take this back to my wife in San Salvador. The transmitter must have been in one of those." Then a soldier came over to Monterrosa to tell him he had a radio call, and he got off to take it. Greentree was in a great hurry to get back to the capital. He has long since forgotten why. I saw that another helicopter was getting ready to take off, and I was in such a hurry to get back that I got off and climbed aboard. On a hill northwest of the town, the guerrillas of the ERP watched excitedly as the Huey slowly rose above the tree line. They waited until it had reached its apogee, pointed a remote-controlled device in a direct line of sight, and pressed the button. Nothing happened. "We didn't know what had gone wrong," Villalobos said. "We thought we had a malfunction." Then he heard his press conference. Monterrosa was apparently being interviewed by radio, announcing his destruction of Radio Venceramos, and we realized that it was on the wrong helicopter. They sat tensely on the hill deep into the afternoon, until at last, after what must have seemed an interminable wait, a second helicopter climbed above the treetops and lofted into space. The big aircraft rose above Jalteca, turned and began to head west toward the Sapo River, toward the tiny hamlet of El Mozote. Poised high in the blue sky, it caught the sun. Far below, a man from Peking gazed upward, squinted, and then saw the machine of war he had seen so many times over Morazan suddenly blossom into a great orange and black fireball, and then he was deafened by the explosion. "I remember thinking to myself," told the man, who had been forced to guide Monterrosa's men on their limpieza 3 years before. "I remember thinking, if only he had gone a few minutes more, his blood would have been mixed with the soil of El Mozote." But, yeah, that ends the chapter, so we'll end the episode there. And we'll be able to start next episode on chapter 9. So, yeah. The bomb that the guerrillas had set up in the transmitter, it went off in the other helicopter. So they thought it was on the first one. That wasn't it. No. And then the second one rose. It took off. And as it was flying toward El Mozote, it blew up. And yeah, the guy says, yeah, he forced me to take them to El Mozote. And I thought to myself, if it had only been a little further, he would have died and his blood mixed at the site of that massacre. You know, as almost fitting for what had happened, what Monterrosa had done. But yeah, we can see there is so much grievance and pain tied to the event. Even Monterrosa didn't like fully acknowledging what had happened. But yeah, you can tell there's a lot of, even by Monterrosa himself, who was in command of it and everything, he's kind of disgusted with how it went down. You can tell there's a bit of distaste. He's like, no, it's not what everybody thinks. But they said that when he was talking to a different reporter at another time in frustration, he just said, yeah, we did it. We committed the limpieza. So yeah. It's yeah, you can the details keep slowly leaking out how others even involved in it feel afterwards. I tell you what, it's something else. But we'll go ahead and end this episode here. As always, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. Cite their sources. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.